being involved. So that's what I would like to encourage you. Be activists. Join civil organization. Join a political party. Get involved in reform movements. Then you can reach out to the massa.
Maybe we have to look at RA 673, a very romanticized law that says that everybody should be neutral. So I mean, we just love to romanticize things in this country, you know. Anyway, actually, I'd like to end by asking a question, Professor. Really, honestly, how have you addressed, say, the specific concerns of the Inuits or the disagreeing minorities in Canada, or how, for instance, the future of the Aborigines in Australia, how have they fared under a federal structure? I mean, were there institutional interventions? I guess I mentioned this because to a certain extent we have a very, very similar concern, not only in Mindanao, but even up north in the Cordilleras, where you have a lot of what we call IPs, indigenous peoples, and how have they fared under a federal structure, and will their quote-unquote rights be more protected under such? Thank you.
This is a big subject, so I'll try just to sort of and give a little bit of history. I mean, I don't think any of the countries in the Western Hemisphere can take great pride in how the history over the long period of dealing with indigenous people. You know, they were basically, in Latin America, they were basically suppressed, and in the United States, there were wars and the migrations and so on. There was a bit more, while all this was going on, there was always a structure of philosophy about how to deal with the recognition of nations. In fact, one of the reasons for the War of Independence in the United States was that the British had reached an agreement with the Indians west of the Alleghenies, of the Appalachians, on a limit to Western expansion of the 13 colonies. And the colonists, and this was done because the British were managing military relations and worrying about the French in the north and so on. And this was a major concern of the colonists, and one of the causes for the war. So by the time we got to the middle of the 20th century, I won't walk you through all these centuries of history, we had everywhere indigenous people who were in a very disadvantaged position. Attitudes started to change, and I'll just give you a little bit of Canadian experience. I mean, in Canada, the Indians, who are the largest population by far, are on what we call reserves in the United States reservations, and we had about 650 bands on well over 2,000 reserves. So some of them were on more than one patch of land. And typically these were very small communities. The average size in the 60s was, around 1,000 people, and even less. So, but the government decided, and they had been administered as wards of the state. So as wards, they were treated like children. Technically, they were not citizens. They didn't have the right to vote. They couldn't buy alcohol, and if they lived on the reserves, they had a system where the federal government basically ran the reserve. But clearly this was no longer legitimate. So in the 50s they were given the vote and what have you. But then in the 60s we started moving towards self-government on reserve, and also towards resolving amateur rights issues, which in some cases had not been settled. But both of these were problematic. With self-government, it's very difficult to delegate all the responsibilities of provincial-type governments down to communities of 600, 700 people. And also some of the structures that you would normally put in place to assure the quality of public administration were done. So there's been a tremendous growth of self-government on Indian reserves, but in my view it has not been very well thought through, and it has been in a number of cases problematic. On the issue of dealing with claims, the Indians in most of the southern parts of Canada in the east and in most of the prairies were already under treaty. But the Indians in northern Quebec, the far north, and in British Columbia were not under treaty. So there was a whole question of bringing them under treaty. The first of the modern treaties, what are called the comprehensive treaties, was with the Cree of James Bay, which is in northern Quebec, and this was because there were plans for big hydro development, and they were able to use modern communications, modern PR to make it impossible for Quebec to proceed with that project until they'd done a deal with the local people. And they got wonderful publicity. They had canoes going down the Hudson River to New York City. And it was clear that the American buyers of the electricity weren't prepared to buy it if this issue hadn't been settled. So that led to the first of the modern claim settlements, which was quite different. No longer did you just have a small reserve, but you had a whole area that was deemed to be an area of interest, and within that area there were different rights according to the parts of the area. In some areas it was basically like fee simple. In other areas they had rights relating to hunting and what have you. They also got a share of revenues. They were given money that was put into development funds. And I would say the James Bay Treaty has been very successful. And that was followed by other treaties in northern Quebec, and a similar treaty within the Northwest Territories, and another one within the Yukon Territory with the Inuit, with the Indians of the Northwest Territories and the Indians of the Yukon. For the Inuit were unlike the Indians elsewhere in that they had this vast territory where they were actually the majority of the population. So there was an agreement done with them, which was to create a new territory, which is, like a province, but doesn't have the full status of a province, but where you would have public government. And so in the case of what's now called Nunavut, you have a public government where whites and Inuit, or there are some Indians living there, or could be Filipinos or Chinese or whoever happens to be living there. There are lots of people from all over the world up there. Everybody has, if they're Canadian citizens, they all have the right to vote and work in the government, etc. So the structure there has been quite different. I would say these new arrangements have been very successful politically. They've been, certainly Nunavut is much less successful socially. Part of the problem is that there's no economic base up there at the moment, and there's a very large population explosion, and so you have lots of problems with youth unemployment, with drugs, and people feeling, and kids, they see all the southern culture, and they're in these little isolated communities. So there are big social problems, and it's heavily subsidized by the whole system of government up there is extremely expensive, and so it's required very, very substantial support from the central government. But it's a work in progress, and the area where we're, which is the current toughest one, is this one which I was talking about, which is where there are not agreements, or even if there are agreements, but is this whole question of the right to consult. As things are being done that affect their traditional interests, what are their rights? And that's quite ambiguous. Final comment is that in most of the Indian areas, the people are moving to the cities. And so increasingly the issue is, do we have programs for them when they come off reserve? And unfortunately, the structure at the moment is that in some areas they have programs which really provide an incentive to stay on the reserve where there is no economic base, like free housing, whereas when they move to the city they don't get it. That being said, they are moving to the cities, and there are some programs being brought into the cities which help their social integration into the cities. There are still a lot of social problems associated with that, but it's one of these things where the visible part of the problem is where the visible part is often where the problems are, and statistically the majority are doing not badly, but they aren't seen. That's a bit of a long answer, but...
Okay, we've reached the end of this program, so I'd like to ask each and every one of you to join me in thanking our panelists for what has been an excellent discussion. Oh, and if you will notice, we have been we've been videoing the whole proceedings now, and if you're interested in looking at other fora that have been videoed by the Third World Studies Center, as well as papers from the center, you can always go to the blog of TWSC, which is at uptwsc.blogspot.com. Now, I would like to ask Sir Gorman for his final comments.
I don't have a final comment, but I'm going to put in a plug like you just did, which is if you're interested in doing more work on federalism, just Google Forum of Federations, and it has a lot of material, including a federalism library, and if you want some really exciting TV, there are some videos as well.
So, David?
Thank you, Herman. I really look forward to seeing those videos on federalism.
They've gone viral.
They've gone viral. It's on YouTube. Well, I don't know how to capture everything that we've said here, but it's actually quite striking in such a short amount of time, and with such a great panel that the Third World Studies Center put together here. I think we've actually really hit on some of the key issues and some of the challenges that we see. And one of the things I think with the Philippines, that every new person to the Philippines, and George has commented on this to me privately, it was one of the great things about the Philippines is this willingness to try to learn from their own history, and try to learn from other places, and try to adopt and find creative ways to try to address huge challenges in this country. But of course, I think that willingness to be creative, that openness to try to find creative ways, is one of the great opportunities and hopes for this country. And I think we see that in all the different experiments that are being considered and have been considered over the years. Nonetheless, as Professor Abueva pointed out, and it's something as an outsider one always is struck by, is the structural challenges that exist in society within the Philippines, within the form of governance that is a result perhaps of that, and the enormous challenges that do exist towards trying to create a form of governance, a society that indeed does empower people more than they are empowered at the moment. And I think that one of the perhaps good things and bad things about what we've seen in Mindanao, the autonomous region, is that we've seen what doesn't work with the 1996 agreement, but we've also seen that perhaps as a result of that, we've learned a lot of lessons from that may be applicable hopefully for Mindanao in addressing that very unique problem within the Philippines, but certainly one that's not unique to all the Philippines in the sense of many of the challenges that do exist there. During our brief visit to Cotabato with George over the last couple of days, we were able to, I think, draw a little bit of some of the challenges and some of the contradictions that exist. And then when we met with the government peace panel, and on the one hand, while you see this sort of a knee-jerk reaction, this drive for greater ownership and management of everything down there, with this feeling that they historically, politically, they haven't been understood, and that they have these grievances, and that they felt disempowered as a people, that they want to now take it all on themselves. But as George has pointed out, and as we've learned from other places in the world, be careful of what you wish for. Be careful of taking on all of that. Ownership and management of some of these things can be enormously challenging. In Mindanao, we've seen that the current system obviously doesn't work. That we listened to the former executive secretary under the OIC regional governor, his name was Najib, He's a lawyer and a constitutional law expert down there. And he pointed out how humiliating it was for them to submit these budgets to the national government, in budgets that he thought was actually quite creative, that would address some of the structural problems within the autonomous government, meaning very, very high percentage, I think 70% for payroll, and instead trying to rework the equation to make it less centric on that, and more centric on quick impact projects that could be delivered through communities, through NGOs, through the local government, and be much more responsive to people's needs. But instead, when he went up to Manila, met with the budget office, he found that in fact there was no sense of understanding of trying to find a workable arrangement, a formula, as we've spoken here today, that would actually be appropriate to addressing the real issues down there, the real budgetary issues, but also the real social-political issues. And as we can see, and as George has quite well pointed out, while it is important that the symbols, the rhetoric, are understood and are addressed in the sense of when we look at regional autonomy, whether it be a federal system within the Philippines or whether it be the unique case in Mindanao, we need to start to not only just look at how to address the symbols and the rhetoric, but more importantly, how to also take a step back and look pragmatically at what is actually going to address this issue in the nuts and bolts administration, governance issues, social issues that are going to need to be administered by the local governance. And we've seen and we've conveyed also to the government our thoughts that indeed whatever new arrangement is made, and we've also conveyed this to the MILF, whatever new arrangement is made is indeed an arrangement that empowers the people and not ends up disempowering them or keeping them disempowered as they have been. And I think that's one of the huge challenges that so many countries face around the world that are going through very similar problems on the Philippines in addressing these issues of redistribution and inequity. But as you said before, as we see here in the Philippines, this enormous willingness to try to find a creative solution. Granted, you have the structural challenges here that do exist, but I think that with a lineup here and with the good health of Professor Abueva, that I'm optimistic that the Philippines is going to work through this, both regionally and nationally. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that ends our forum for today. Thank you very much for staying on to the end.
Thank you.